Hello and welcome to today's episode of the Jacksonville Jaguars Insider Podcast. My name is John Shipley. I am your host and beat reporter, and I have been your beat reporter covering the Jacksonville Jaguars for On SI every single day since August 2019, and we are continuing to move forward through yet another season together. As always, you can find us on social media such as Facebook and Twitter at Jaguars on SI, where you will find all of our 24/7 100% free, boots on the ground coverage of the Jacksonville Jaguars each and every day. You can also find us at www.si.com/NFL/Jaguars. All right, folks, welcome to today's episode of the Jacksonville Jaguars Insider Podcast. My name is John Shipley. I'm your host and beat reporter. Today we are going to talk about three Jaguars who I think you will see an uptick in playing time this week. Three Jaguars who ultimately I think are going to play larger roles than maybe they have, in the first 2 weeks of the season, whether it's because of circumstance or whether it's because, frankly, they've earned it. I think the Jaguars, much like any team in the first 2 weeks, are still kind of figuring out who they are, who their playmakers are, who they can lean on, who they will depend on, etc. And in that, I think the Jacksonville Jaguars, have learned plenty in the first 2 weeks, frankly. To me, a big thing when you're a new coach and a new staff, a new regime, is when you first take on a new team, you have to figure out who are the guys you can trust. And I don't mean like trust in terms of, obviously trusting, with responsibilities, telling things, etc. I mean the guys that you can trust on game day to go out there and do their assignment, do the right thing. And I think the Jaguars are learning that. I think they're learning quickly who they can trust and who maybe they can't, especially in high leverage situations. So for me, first name that comes to mind when I think of we'll see more snaps in week 3, it has to be Antonio Johnson. I think that, the Jaguars, they've had, I believe, Darnell Savage played about 36% of the Jaguars' defensive snaps over the first 2 weeks. And now for a singular player, that doesn't sound like that much. It's under 50 snaps total. With that said, that's a sizable role in the Jaguars' defense. About a third of the time they're on the field, they're in dime, and they have a third safety on the field. Now, I asked Liam Cohen about that role at Wednesday's press conference, and whether, he had faith in Antonio Johnson stepping into that role, or whether maybe now that role changes. Now that Darnell Savage is no longer in the picture, do you really have a third safety package that you want to utilize? And, Liam Cohen was very, quick to say, yes, this is a big opportunity for Antonio Johnson. That he can be a very disruptive guy when he's, doing his assignment. And that was the big thing with Antonio as a starter last year. It's not, to me, like intently and maliciously not doing his assignment. It's just a couple hiccups in terms of miscommunications, blown coverages, and that's how the last staff, ended up putting him on the sidelines, and why Darnell Savage got moved back to safety to begin with after he signed to be the team's nickel corner. So I think you'll see more Antonio Johnson this week. How much dime the Jaguars play, that remains to be seen. They do it kind of in obvious passing situations. Like I said, about 36% of the snaps. They did more in week 1 than they did in week 2. You saw more Devin Lloyd in week 2. What they essentially do is they take Devin Lloyd off the field. They move Andrew Wingard down as like kind of a, big nickel kind of linebacker. And then they would add the third safety onto the field. It was obviously Darnell Savage, during the first 2 weeks of the season. With Darnell, now moving on, it's Antonio Johnson. And like I said, it's, about a third of the snaps. It's a prominent role. So I expect Antonio Johnson to play more this week against the Houston Texans. Whether that's something that the Jaguars can turn into a productive role, that remains to be seen. I don't have the splits, for their production in terms of the big nickel packages, in terms of, yards per play given up, EPA per play, success rate, and all that. But I do feel like they've had more success with their base defense. So how prominent of a role that is and how much Antonio Johnson figures to factor into things in terms of the starting lineup, I think that remains to be seen. But I do think that ultimately Antonio Johnson will play by far his biggest role in some time with the Jaguars this Sunday. The next guy, I think, who will see more snaps this week, it's a product of just simply he's earned it. He has done everything since really the offseason to kind of deserve that. His efficiency numbers are off the charts so far to start the season. Parker Washington. I mean, he's only ran 17 routes over the first 2 weeks, guys. 17 routes. That's a bonkers number. And he's produced more than Brian Thomas. He's produced more on a per-touch basis than Travis Hunter. So he's a guy who's playing really well. He just isn't playing enough. And I think they were cognizant, to change that last week. He played about the same number of snaps, but he didn't get any targets, any touches in week 1. That changed, obviously, in week 2 with several big plays, several catches, had a 40-yard catch and run. And had a really impressive play downfield, catching a Trevor Lawrence, deep shot. He was really the only guy to make a contested catch, for the Jaguars so far this season. I think that Parker Washington, they want the passing game to get better quickly. Parker Washington needs to play more snaps. And I'm not saying that because I'm saying Brian Thomas Jr. and Travis Hunter need to play fewer. No. Again, I understand that getting a fourth receiver into the offensive rotation is not the easiest thing to do. But Parker did so much with so little in terms of opportunity and volume in week 2 that I don't think they can justify not having him out there in week 3 against a Houston Texans defense that has a, frankly, significantly better front and secondary and just overall defense and defensive structure than what the Jaguars have played in the first 2 weeks of the season. I mean, I've been really impressed by the Jaguars' offense's highs. It obviously needs to become much more consistent. But they've also played 2 pretty bad defenses. This is the best test for the offense yet. And then finally, the last person who I think will play more, will play a bigger role this week, I truly think Bayshaw Tuden. He obviously played a role in week 2, got a few touches, some carries, made 2 catches, 1 big explosive gain on the screen, 1 nice touchdown where he made a move on Cam Sample. I think you see even more Bayshaw Tuden this week. I think the Jaguars tried to establish the run and establish it over and over, and I see them trying to be the hammer this week, not the nail. I think that's where the Houston defense is maybe a little weaker at, and that has to do in part, I think, with that defensive structure, or structure that Liam Cohen is very familiar with from when D'Amico was with the San Francisco 49ers. They play in wide nines. They spread it out because they want their defensive linemen to pin their ears back and attack. But that creates some opportunity for rushing. Now, the Jaguars rarely took advantage of that in the last few years. But I do think now they have the scheme, the offensive line, and the running backs to take advantage of it. I think you see more Bayshaw Tuden this week. I think you see him get more carries. I think you see him. I could see both him and Travis Etienne honestly getting double-digit carries. To me, that is what the Jaguars need to do to win this week, is to really lean on that run game. And Bayshaw Tuden is a walking big play waiting to happen. I mean, he made 1 play against the Bengals where it wasn't an explosive run. Picked up about 7 or 8 yards. It was a solid run. But he makes a cut. Zone cut. And he, frankly, looks like he teleports about 3 gaps over. The dude is simply dynamic and explosive, and he has earned more touches and more snaps with the Jaguars offense. Not just against the Texans, but moving forward. Thank you guys for joining me for today's episode of the Jacksonville Jaguars Insider Podcast. My name is John Shipley. We'll be back next time.